slightly anxious to see all the gynecologists and speak on a topic of gynecology. So I stand myself like a England team visiting the Motera pitch in Ahmedabad, and I don't know what I'm going to face. But at the same time, I will not criticize like the England people. Let me take it a drive forward and try to play it with a good footwork. So as we have been talking about it, as you have been seeing with the advancement of the science and the technology, that we have come forward with assisting reproduction technology in people who find it difficult or unable to conceive, which has been long still imbibed in the society as a social stigma. So we are taking a step forward, but as you keep taking step forward, as you say, every action has an opposite reaction. So nothing comes without an untoward reaction also. Now, most important for us is to what to do when you face an untoward reaction or an untoward event. So coming through this, I would be really optimistic that if I skip the hormones here and there, I would like the gynecologist to kindly give me that relaxation, and I would not try to mention much on the hormone side still. But anyways, so taking to the topic, now this is a very unusual scenario because a couple who is trying to conceive, trying hard to fight the social stigma, their mental imbalance, psychological, and do mind, it's a lot of financial implication also. And then when it meets an untoward outcome, the total issue takes a lot of paradigm shift. Now, why it is important, what we usually try to teach all our colleagues in our critical care or anesthesia conference, obstetrics and pediatrics, a bad outcome is not what one expects. Everyone wants a positive outcome. But the problem with the obstetric, pediatric or infertility is we are treating an apparently young female, right? So accepting a bad outcome is very difficult, and then managing it is equally difficult. And then trying to make sure that we have a successful outcome so that the patient and the family comes out of it is a very dedicated work, and which requires, without any thought, a very good dynamic team. Without a good dynamic team, anything is incomplete. Now, what goes through it? So, as we were talking about the ovarian stimulation, then the difficult job was to talk after Dr. Sumaina talks. So, it's like batting after Virat Kohli. Okay, so the level of parameters keeps increasing. So instead of the ovaries, I thought I got hyperstimulated today. So that is also fair enough. Now, what happens as she was talking, that we try to stimulate an ovary and try to assist the reproduction. Now, sometimes when this stimulation goes hyper, because it's an hormonal thing, sometimes there are a lot of homeostasis that happens. In spite of all the calculations, sometimes we may go over the board, the response of the patient might not be predictable, or there might be some other factor that adds up. And that is where it leads to a problematic situation called the ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. Now, it is almost associated with the exogenous. As she was talking, the natural conception and the clomiphene, the chances of hyperstimulation syndrome are almost nil. But whenever you go with an assisted reproduction technique, as she was mentioning that the HCG what we use, the half-life of HCG is approximately 60 hours. So that is what it makes that the stimulation is more, and that is what it can cause more stimulation leading to the problems. Now, what are the risk factors? I would just try to touch upon the basic risk factors. That is only for the identification and triaging system. I would not really mention on what are the possibilities or prevention aspects or the primary prevention. As a gynecologist, you all know a lot better than what I know. You all would be doing that. Just for touching at any young lady, obviously we are dealing with young ladies less than 30 years with a known history of polycystic ovarian syndrome or with a past history of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome will have a higher chance of getting this syndrome. So, as we are discussing, what is the basic pathophysiology of this stimulation syndrome? Now, what was more important? So, this was also something like COVID. So, when COVID started, everyone had no idea what's going on. Everyone started using a fantasy term. Everyone started using fantasy drugs. There are thousands of drugs in trial and there are 10,000 in the pipeline. We don't know whether COVID will end or not, but the research with the COVID continues. Same thing was with this thing. So when we started these assisted reproduction techniques or the fertility clinics, what happened was whenever we hyperstimulated, we thought it was because of more of the hormones. We thought either the HCG hormone is getting more or the estradiol complication is getting more. That is what the previous theory was. But what it was found that now the theory is it is the vascular endothelial growth factor and the interleukins and the cytokines that lead to this inflammatory syndrome and which cause a series of reactions that lead to the clinical manifestations and untoward outcome. So what's more important for us is to realize when it happens, because again it's a clinical diagnosis supplemented by your lab tests. So you will have to be a very meticulous clinician to diagnose it at an appropriate time so that you can prevent this, what it's called as an iatrogenic devastating complication of fertility. So whenever you have these things, it leads to the tissue edema and lead to a third space fluid loss leading to hypotension. And once the hypotension happens, it leads to a series of complication of fluid accumulation in your body, like the third space fluid like ascites, pleural effusion, your kidneys not perfusing well, and that leads to a series of this thing. So as I was telling, more of diagnosis is a clinical diagnosis. Only you do a lab test to assess the severity of the syndrome. So all this history, as Sumaina was telling, we do take into picture. And then what are the symptoms? As you said, patient usually complains of abdominal bloating, distension, or sometimes pain, which is usually misinterpreted that after the procedure you are supposed to have some pain. It might be a spasm. So this is where it starts, because it is very subtle in onset. You have to be meticulous in knowing if the patient has a risk factor and complaining of excessive pain. This could be a possibility of the hyperstimulation syndrome in the beginning. Now, examination, as we have been doing, it's very meticulous. Once a patient comes to the ICU with a suspected diagnosis of a hyperstimulation syndrome, very meticulous clinical examination is of paramount importance, especially is the hydration status, her abdominal status, how is her abdominal, tense or not, is there any perianal or vulval swelling or there or not, and most important is her urinary output. So, as I said, it is more of a clinical diagnosis. Only to assess the severity of the syndrome, we go with the laboratory test, right? So, we do arterial blood gas and other supplementary tests to know what are the end organ damage, if any. Now, this is the RCOG classification which you all are well aware with, where we divide this syndrome into mild, moderate, severe. Now, what in critical care we just teach is we do use ultrasound in critical care for all the basic purposes. So we do a lot of screening. If the patient is having ascites with the background of infertility treatment, we take it as moderate. If the patient is having any end organ damage, we take it as critical. So that it becomes easy for us in triaging and more focusing on the reversing the trend that is causing a problem. There is a different classification by Foxy and the RCOG, but this is what we usually take. Patient having ascites, she is moderate. Patient having any end organ damage with a borderline hypotension, she is supposed to be critical. Now, in the management and all, what they are stressing nowadays with the more onset of fertility clinics is to have a clinic where we can properly guide, manage and avoid these things. As you always know that prevention is better than cure. But then sometimes with all the proper things in place also, sometimes we might face this issue. Usually in mild to moderate, mild cases, usually OPD treatment, it subsides. But when patient comes to it, obviously it is either severe or critical, right? So what as I was telling is, if the patient does not conceive, usually within a week or two it subsides, there ends the issue. But then next cycle, she is a high risk patient for your IUI as well as for pregnancy, because all these patients who develop hyperstimulation syndrome can land them into preeclampsia or a preterm delivery. Now, whenever patient comes to us in the ICU, more important for us is how tense is the abdomen. Now, why that is important? Two things. If the abdomen is tense, her respiratory embarrassment will be more. If the abdomen is tense, her intra-abdominal pressure is more, which may compromise on the renal perfusion. And do believe, if the patient develops an acute kidney injury itself is an independent predictor for mortality in any scenario. Any case, patient having an acute kidney injury, it's an independent predictor. So your chance here is to decrease if there is a tense ascites, to tap the ascitic fluid. More important is to maintain the intra-abdominal pressure in the lower thing so that the renal perfusion happens better and patient gets perfused. Most of the times whenever our duty doctors or the casualty or a junior registrar, patient complains of breathlessness, give Lasix. That is the most common mistake what we have done. So iatrogenic giving Lasix because already intravascular depleted, the patient will land up into further end organ damage. As far as possible, avoid Lasix. But if patient develops a pulmonary edema, there you can use a loading dose of Lasix, but not a continuous dose of Lasix. Now, what is more important? As you know, all the therapies we try to maintain. Now, the most important criteria from the critical care: what fluids to be used, how much to be used. Now people, there is no difference between crystalloid and colloid. Whatever you can give rapidly is more important at an earlier time. Only when you are doing a large abdominal paracentesis where you remove more than 3 to 4 liters, you might have to use a colloid or an albumin. Now, what is the advantages? Albumin might get reactions. Colloids are easily available. You don't have to cross-match them, and it avoids your further third space loss. But again, this effect is temporary. This is only a bridging therapy, not a mandatory therapy. And you cannot use more than 20 ml per kg of colloid per day. Right? That is one thing. Second thing, what people have noted that because it is everything sterile, I can just tap it in the sterile condition and auto transfuse it. Because there is a lot of protein that is being lost. That is the reason there is edema and all those things. But what we have to understand, as I've said earlier also in my topic, the basic pathophysiology is not the hormones, it is the interleukins and the vascular endothelial growth factor and the other inflammatory mediators. So whenever you are removing this fluid, those mediators are present in the fluid also. So when you auto transfuse them, you are again inducing a storm in the same patient. So that is why auto transfusion has not been put in the criteria, so it is not encouraged at all. The basic concept, if you can preserve the renal perfusion of the patient without causing a respiratory embarrassment, that should be your primary goal. Most of the important, you give any fluid, RL or thing, I would only request all of you to avoid using dextrose containing solutions in any patients. If there is a documented hypoglycemia, kindly use 25% dextrose. Using a maintenance fluid of dextrose worsens your hypotension as well as your edema. Now the other more important thing, so once you take care of the decreased pressure, you tap the fluid, you give the adequate fluid repletion, most of the time patient survives, and within a day or two you see a very dramatic improvement, and immediately you, within a 24 to 36 hours, you can mobilize your patient from a ICU to a high dependency unit or a post-op ward. The idea is, it is like the sepsis bundle. How we have a sepsis bundle, within first 3 hours you take the sample, antibiotic, culture. If your patient is a hyperstimulation syndrome, as I said, it's a clinical diagnosis, assess the severity and be very rapid in correction of the severity. There is no role of any specific thing if this has to be done or this. Maintain the hydration, decrease the intra-abdominal pressure, maintain the perfusion of the kidneys properly, see that patient does not land into a respiratory arrest, because then it associates with other complications rather than focusing on the complication which you already have. Now one more important thing, analgesia, though patients have pain and all, we use either paracetamol or sometimes we do suggest opioids. Now this again comes with a grey shade, because when the patient is mild to moderate, where you are thinking that I may balance this patient conservatively, suppressing the pain might be you are trying to conceive the pain, which might be because of the torsion or a ruptured cyst. So be wise and regular monitoring of the patient who is on opioids for the pain relief. Your patient might land up into some of the unnecessary issues. So regular scanning and examination of the patient again becomes important. Now most important thing is the thromboprophylaxis, because of the sluggish flow, the viscosity, the hormonal issue, and pregnancy, fertility, it itself supposed to be a prothrombotic state, so the risk of thromboembolism is high. All these patients should receive a thromboprophylaxis without any fail. Now antibiotics is only one thing. Now antibiotics, why it's important? Because frequent examination, you might do a tapping, pervaginal examination. So we use antibiotics to prevent us secondary or super added infections. Rather than antibiotic per se has no major role in management of your hyperstimulation syndrome. Diuretics, I have said luteal support, I think that you all know. Now the only issue, what is important is this thing. As I was telling, whenever you get a patient, see to it that you just give a bolus of say around 500 ml to a liter, either NS or RL. If you are having a colloid, that is hydroxyethyl starch or a Hemasil and all, hydroxyethyl starch nowadays is coming with a warning. In a patients who are hypoperfused, especially trauma patients, when you give hydroxyethyl starch, it has found to be associated with increased chance of acute kidney injury. So nowadays in the ICUs, we are totally avoiding hydroxyethyl starch. So you can use either Hemasil, which is a gelatin, or albumin, that is best. But again, albumin comes with a pinch of things. It is financially more costlier and it can cause some allergic reactions too. But the basic idea is to maintain a good perfusion. If the patient is getting a good output, her heart is fair enough to take care of her, provided your cardiologist is on call. And then the most important thing, the abdomen should be relaxed. Patient's respiratory embarrassment should not be there. Patient should not be hyperventilating. And if you have an ABG, patient should not be hyperventilating where your CO2 comes down, or they should not be in acidosis. Or if you can see a lactate on your ABG, the lactate is a count of a peripheral perfusion. You don't have to know more about lactate, what is lactate A, lactate B, what are the other things, just to get an idea, is your patient improving or not? So that you also have an idea, and as a team you can support each other. It looks very simple, but all these decisions are to be on a simultaneous note, which makes a paramount importance, and it in the within the spirited time that you're supposed to make a call. You can sit in the home and think about it, that's very easy. A patient coming with it with different manifestations, different severity, end organ damage. So it becomes a very important, maintain a good team approach, avoid unnecessary use of medicines, and try to keep your simple. Always the training in the critical care is keep the things simple. Right? Like Shiv Khera, one of the famous authors, says that the winner don't do different things. They only do things differently. So this is what the idea you should take. Critical care is all about common sense, which is the most commonest thing lacking nowadays. So this is the checklist we maintain in the ICU for a patient coming with us with a hyperstimulation syndrome, so that no one goes miss. It's like the Swiss cheese model pattern, where your ICU in charge sister cross-checks the checklist, your registrar checks it, and as a HOD you are supposed to cross-check it and then sign it. If you are in the team approach, the gynecologist, the anesthetist, or the critical care person, along with your ICU staff nurse, all three of you cross-check it. If you can improve the perfusion, you can guarantee a safe outcome. Thank you.